evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here once again, Professor. I appreciate your hospitality and the opportunity to speak. So, in the last several weeks, I've given a few presentations about my dissertation. You've seen two of the three papers of my dissertation, and now this is the third and final paper of my dissertation, broadly related to resilience and government structure. The case I'm looking at is Hong Kong transboundary water governance between Hong Kong and China. So in this presentation, I'll talk a bit about the background of this research, produce a problem statement, talk about what the literature has already said and where the gaps are. I propose a new theoretical model to examine the issue and apply it to the case, and I conclude with some words about future research. So, a background. In Hong Kong, 70 to 80% of the water comes from the Dong River in China, the East River. This is done through several contracts, a series of contracts that the Hong Kong government has with Guangdong. Desalination is a process that has had halting adoption in Hong Kong over the years. It has not been pursued recently, primarily because it's been considered expensive compared to the alternative sources. Hong Kong also has a seawater toilet flushing program and other types of programs that they would call sort of total water management, aiming at long-term supply, protection of resources, and reclamation and desalination. The last desalination plant was out of commission 30 years ago. It was only in operation for 5 years, sadly, despite all of the investment that went into it. But it was quickly evident by the early 80s that simply purchasing water from neighboring China was cheaper than the continued operation of the plant. However, some supply constraints have convinced the government that it is feasible to invest in additional desalination facilities. So the next one will be online in 2020 at a cost of $1.2 billion. And it is in response to not only the drought, which is sort of a short-term concern at this stage, but also for increasing demand upstream in China. And that demand. So the background. 40 million people are in this massive urban region in this part of called the Pearl River Delta. This includes Hong Kong, Guangdong province, and cities like Guangzhou. By 2030, water demand in Hong Kong proper will be 40% higher than it was in 2012. So clearly the problem of water procurement in Hong Kong is both a demand side and a supply side issue. Further to that point, Guangdong province itself is experiencing rapid industrialization and population growth, which has placed some further demand on its water resources. So for instance, Guangdong has now invested in power generation capacity improvement by 45% in the last 5 years, which is indicative of the type of growth that they're anticipating in the province. This is all the more critical to China's economic growth prospects and economic stability due to the fact that a lot of the country's economic engines are located in that region and do rely on the water resources that they're in. There have been others that have predicted severe water shortages by 2020, but those are way out in the future and obviously difficult to predict based on some of the instability. Now, in looking at Hong Kong is often compared to Singapore in many ways. Both of them are small, economically vibrant financial centers with relatively similar population sizes, although Hong Kong is a bit larger. In both cases, there's an absence of a hinterland. So if we take a look at Hong Kong purely as what used to be sort of the autonomous region of Hong Kong, which is primarily a city, it is similar to Singapore in the absence of a hinterland. It has relative autonomy. Some would argue less autonomy over time, and that's been a political issue in the last couple of years in the city. Both have strong bullish economic growth, and they are both next to a very powerful neighbor. Hong Kong, of course, to China, and Singapore to Malaysia. And the Singapore water model is being held up against the Hong Kong water model as a paragon of resilience and self-sustenance and eliminating the renewal of supply contracts. So previously, Singapore had bought water from Malaysia, but due to sort of political reasons and security reasons and otherwise, Singapore has been very motivated to invest in alternative sources and thus reduce or eliminate its reliance on Malaysia. So some of those contracts with Malaysia will be allowed to expire in the next 20 to 30 years, I believe. The creative initiatives that include new water. New water is actually very interesting, and it's not being done very much around the world. So reclamation and purification of wastewater into drinkable water. And this, of course, is an idea that some people have had difficulty getting their minds around. But in fact, yes, wastewater has been turned into drinking water. And in fact, I think anecdotally, the water is much purer than the water that actually comes out of the standard tap. And is actually so pure in some instances that it's not suitable for some industrial processes. So they have gone overboard in purifying this water. But again, there's still a psychological block to drinking wastewater. So, what is the problem then? Well, in Hong Kong, there are several problems. The first is the fragmentation of water governance. So there are 11 bureaus and offices under 3 different secretaries. I've just listed a few of them there. They address a variety of different issues related to urban development and management, but all relate in some capacity to water. By contrast, in Singapore, the Public Utilities Board manages all departments whose operations concern water. So there's a much more sort of a centralized and coordinated governance system, an integrated approach, if you will, as I've said, that looks at the water loop. So treatment, distribution, reclamation, and stormwater. I've included from the Straits Times at the bottom left, this is where our water comes from in Singapore, not Hong Kong. And you'll see that the very ambitious goal for 2060 is up to 50% of this reclaimed wastewater, 30% of desalination, and then reservoir and imported water being the balance of the two, with imported water reducing over time. Now, aside from fragmentation, another problem is economic inefficiency. It's a pricing problem in Hong Kong. The water tariffs are 1/3 of Singapore's. They are heavily subsidized. Consumer prices have not changed since 1995, 20 years. The seawater flushing system, which is for toilets, is free and must recoup its operating costs in other ways. The cost of supplying water over the past roughly 20 years has increased by nearly 70%, but the cost of recovery has done almost a mirror image in decline. So the cost of recovery being receiving revenues from water usage. So they used to receive more than they needed, and now it's far less. So there's a perverse incentive on the consumer part to overconsume. That is, individual residential consumers and business consumers. Now, related here to inefficiencies, fragmentation. This gets a bit to my previous point, but I included it here in economic inefficiency because I think that, excuse me, fragmentation not only constrains the ability of governance to function well, but it also creates inefficiencies due to redundancy, so operational costs and things of this nature. Now, if we look at moral hazard, this is a graph that I produced that represents Don River water supply, which is along the x-axis, and expenditures on alternative supply. So currently, the point at Q sub I represents the currently contracted amount of water that Hong Kong is getting from China. And B1 is the current budget line. So what I'm arguing here is that a rise from B1 to B2, the budget line, will increase, Don River supply will stay the same, but it will increase the expenditures that can be applied towards alternative sources. So further appropriation of funding towards water procurement in Hong Kong will go almost entirely towards alternative sources because contracts with Guangdong are already locked into place. But I use the term moral hazard. If we're familiar with this, it's the same concept as sort of buying insurance. If you have insurance on your car, you may drive more quickly because you know that you'll be bailed out. In this case, Hong Kong is reliant on a single source of water, the Dong River, about 80%, as I said. So there's no real incentive to invest in alternative sources. So this has created a backlog of projects that have gone unfunded and unimplemented. It has also created a bit of an infrastructure deficit in regards to other types of procurement. Now, what does the literature say about these problems? I've broken it down into the 3 different types of literature. There's the transboundary governance literature, which addresses a variety of different issues in transboundary governance. So, of course, the handover in '97 has received quite a bit of attention in the literature. But more specifically to my point, Leo and Williams' 2014 reports are very helpful. Water governance histories comparing Singapore and Hong Kong. It's a very helpful report, however, it's not necessarily an academic report. It's very descriptive and does not leave a lot of room for theoretical exploration of some of these governance dynamics. Others studies have looked at cooperation on ecological modernization and on transboundary economic ties. But I argue it's largely a technical literature. So the theory about governance and institutions is largely unexplored. The same would hold true for the environmental sustainability literature, which largely addresses the functional aspects of water conservation. Yes, quite helpful systems and usage and state intervention. However, it's not necessarily focusing on the types of institutional interactions, especially in a transboundary environment, that I'm looking at. By contrast, this paper, the paper I have, is a resilience-based structural reform. So these are solutions that are technical to the water problem. I'm arguing there is a solution to the water problem that is structural and institutional, to what I describe as a step change in the sustainability priorities in the governance structure. Also a focus on structural dimensions, because I argue that under the current circumstances, Hong Kong's governance system will not be able to absorb some of the supply shocks that may happen in the coming years. The final literature is the institutional literature, which I've discussed before. So this is relevant in this case. Both Hong Kong and Singapore have divergent development paths that have to do with becoming self-sustainable in the midst of a larger regional kind of power dynamic. Institutional rational choice, which is primarily applied to the behavior of human beings, of individuals. That is, we pursue our own best interest. It's sort of the idea that we're sort of rational actors of a Simon kind of nature. The empirical studies are numerous. We talk about congressional behavior, reciprocity in common pool resource management, that's CPRs, social institutions, and contracts. So these are common issues that are brought up in institutions. However, there's also public choice literature that looks at the other side of institutions, saying that in the governance context, institutions often fail. So I'm drawing a little bit on this literature in developing my theoretical model, which is the next part of the presentation. So a theoretical model has two characteristics. First, it talks about what I call actor agencies. So I previously mentioned that the institutional economics literature examines the behavior of individuals. I'm looking at the behavior of agencies, in other words, these 13 agencies in the fragmented Hong Kong governance ecology, that behave themselves as rational and self-interested bodies, even if they are agencies rather than individuals. They are led by individuals, for instance. So that is the unique approach to the first one. The second one is the transboundary dynamics as institutional parameters. This adds complexity because it's not just about one ecological system or one political system. It's about how the dynamics occur across different political systems, or as they say in China, the one country, two systems kind of thing, which I think gives this study a unique context. And finally, I focus on the interests of these individuals, the origins of their interests, in other words, their service to support strategic directives that come from higher up, political directives, for instance, the execution of those interests and those directives. I describe a distance, decay, and coordination. This is a pretty standard way of saying that when there are multiple actors that are executing certain strategic directives, they're going to be interpreted in different ways and implemented in different ways. And consequently, the outcomes, my third point, will be different among them as well. So I begin with this 2x2 goods matrix, which I've referenced before. The matrix on the left is rivalrous versus non-rivalrous. That is the zero-sum nature of goods. If I have one, you can't have that one. So I'm wearing my shoes, but you can't wear my shoes at the same time. Versus something like a radio broadcast, where if I'm listening to the radio broadcast, it doesn't keep you from listening to the radio broadcast. So that's on the left axis. The top one is excludable versus non-excludable. Excludable means you can keep people away, or keep people from consuming, and non-excludable means you can't. So what I'm arguing here is that water is a toll good. So a toll good is non-rivalrous, meaning if I consume water, it doesn't mean you can't. And it's also excludable, meaning that if you don't pay your bills, your water can be shut off. Or in the case of Hong Kong, the Dong River tap can be turned off if they fail to meet their contractual obligations. I also argue that water is, in the context of the overall region, a common pool resource. So there is a characteristic of that too, because all of the cities in China and Hong Kong are both are all drawing from this one source. So there is not necessarily a way to exclude in the sense that the river is accessible to all, at least in China. There is possibly a way to exclude for Hong Kong. I'm rescaling the user, the buy-sell dynamics away from the individual households and up to sort of the buy-sell dynamics between Hong Kong and China. So consequently, the action arena, if you're familiar with the IAD concept, is what I call crowded actors from both sides of the border. Can the IAD accommodate this? Well, here's the IAD. You've seen it as well before. So on the left side, physical conditions, attribution, rules, and use. I'll get into those. And then the action situations and the actors. The actors are where the complexity of this case come in, because they're actors from both sides of the borders, and they are beholden to different types of institutional constraints, different political directives, and different economic motivations. Now, so I argue that that's not necessarily enough to accommodate the complexity of this. So I looked at a Jensen-Lang's framework from 2013 for transboundary water governance. They talk about the several different types of actors that you see there. And I'm arguing that the Hong Kong case must be examined at two scales, national and regional. The national scale is the riparian environment of the Dong Rivers, primarily in China. And, but then on the other side, Hong Kong is the end user in this case. The regional is that there's a reliance on both for the water from the river, and the environmental impacts can bleed over into both locations. So this is their framework. So you can see this show up in the national political economy and the regional, which means the transboundary political economy of water. And you're accounting for institutions, stakeholders, and others. So there's a bit of overlap with the IAD framework, but not necessarily enough, so I combined them. So the overall architecture is, you recall this from previous, I applied this in the study of a New Zealand case as well. I break the national and the regional aspects of the good now. So you see national, the physical condition, water is whole good. Regional, the physical condition, water is common pool resource. The rules and use are domestic law versus transboundary contracts. The attributes are governance or regulation, regulatory fragmentation, and in Hong Kong's case, the attributes of the regional environment are institutionalized interactions and economic interdependence. So that allows the complex case to be sort of analyzed in a systematic sort of way. And you'll see the actors' degree of power and institutional responsibilities are all accounted for by the IAD. So, the second to last part, how then is this applied? This combined framework, the action arena with multiple actors, hierarchical system of actors, in other words, different agencies that are either below or above each other in terms of strategic importance. Environmental concerns cross political boundaries, and that's what this framework accounts for, and the transboundary government issue. Now, the transboundary environment can be analyzed as a single unit. So, as I said, the physical condition is water is a whole good and common pool resource. The rules and use are national versus regional agreements, and the attributes are informal norms and institutions, interdependence, and implicit strategic interaction among the Hong Kong water agencies. And I'm not talking specifically about the interaction between Hong Kong and Chinese agencies. So, in conclusion, this framework presents a practical link. The practical link is the domestic governance systems versus the transboundary environmental management. How can domestic governance systems be improved or reformed to generate a better or more effective transboundary environmental management? That's the argument. The theoretical link is the structure of governance, which can reside in the institutional literature or the public administration literature, basically how governance systems are structured, and resilience. And by resilience, I mean the ability to withstand shock events in supply. So, for instance, if the Dong River is overdrawn upstream because there's too much industrial development, or if there's a drought in the Pearl River Delta, which there currently is right now. The resilience, this governance structure and resilience would lead, say, to investment in alternative sources. So the next phase of this work is going to be interviews with the Hong Kong government, which will be 1 year from now in Hong Kong. And the goal is ultimately to understand the importance of governance structure in the more general sense, the value to the literature, understand the structure of individual policy issues, and the broader concepts of resilience. Now the last slide, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, conceptualizing a framework versus a theory is sometimes a bit confusing. Adela Schlager wrote an article in Sabatier's book identifying the unique characteristics of frameworks versus theory. So a framework is a list of variables. This is just a list of variables. But a theory, to develop a testable theory, or a hypothesis rather, you have to have relationships among variables. So I'm using the same framework that I had introduced previously. I'm looking at regulatory fragmentation as a political economy, and I'm looking at agency interests and their relationships between the two in generating transboundary water governance. So the challenge then will be to create variables for these and to test them against one another. So that concludes the presentation, and I'll be happy to take any